Grisly crimes from past. Lizzie and the axe. According to the immortal rhyme, Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When he saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. But according to American justice, the 32-year-old spinster was not responsible for the bloody slaughter of Andrew J. Borden and his wife Abby. She was acquitted after a 10-day trial, and the courtroom rang with applause at the verdict. Ever since, the world has wondered why. The Borden household at 92 2nd Street in the Massachusetts cotton spinning town of Fall River had never been a happy one. Andrew was a crusty, puritanical character whose one aim in life was making money and holding on to it. He had amassed $500,000 from shrewd business dealing, first as an undertaker, then as a property speculator and banker. His first wife, Sarah Morse Borden, died in 1862, 2 years after giving birth to his second daughter, christened Lizzie Andrew, because Borden wanted a boy. Borden married again 2 years later, but it was no love match. Abby Dufresne Gray was a plain, plump woman of 37, more of a housekeeper than a wife, and there was no love lost between her and Borden's two girls. The elder sister Emma called her Abby. Lizzie called her Mrs. Borden, refused to eat at the same table as her, and spoke with her only when it was essential. Despite Borden's wealth, the family lived in conditions worse than many of the town's humble mill workers. The unsanitary Whitewood house had staircases at the front and back, which was as well because the friction in the family meant the bedroom doors upstairs were kept locked at all the times. The parents switching their room via the rear stairs, the girls using the front ones. Lizzie's resentment of her stepmother and the way they lived boiled over when her father, whom she loved dearly, put up the money for Abby's sister, Mrs. Whitehead, to buy a house from which she faced eviction. Borden presented the title deeds to his wife, and when Lizzie found out, she regarded it as further proof that Mrs. Borden was only after her father's riches. Shortly afterward, Mr. Borden arrived home from business to be told by Lizzie that his wife's bedroom has been ransacked by a burglar. He reported the incident to police, but soon cut short their inquiries when it became clear that Lizzie herself had done the damage during one of her funny turns. Lizzie was plain, introspective, and repressed with genteel pretensions. The curly-haired redhead had a small circle of very close friends. Though she belonged to the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was treasurer and secretary of a local Christian Endeavor Society, and taught a Sunday school of Chinese men at the local Congregational Church, she spent most of her time in more solitary pursuit, fishing or merely brooding at her bedroom window. There was plenty for her to brood about. In the summer of 1892, Fall River sweltered in a heat wave. In May, the tedium of the Borden's lifestyle was interrupted when intruders twice broke into the outhouse at the bottom of their garden. Mr. Borden's reaction was somewhat bizarre. Sure that the intruders were after Lizzie's pet pigeon, he took an axe to the birds and decapitated them. By August, the heat had become so bad that Emma left to stay with friends in the country at Fairhaven, 20 miles away. Lizzie stayed at home for a special meeting of the Christian Endeavor Society. The weather made no difference to Mr. Borden's plans for running an economical household. The family sat down to a monstrous joint of muttons, cooked by their only servant, an Irish girl called Bridget, and served up in various guises at every meal. Everyone except Lizzie was violently ill. Although 4th of August dawned as the hottest day of the year, the family routine went on just the same. After breakfast, Mr. Borden set out to check on his businesses. John Morse, brother of his first wife, who was staying for a few days, left to visit other relatives. Mrs. Borden began dusting the rooms, and Bridget, still queasy from food poisoning, washed the window. Lizzie came down later than the rest and was soon seen ironing some clothes in the kitchen. Shortly after 9:30, Mrs. Borden, on her knees dusting in the spare bedroom upstairs at the front of the house, was struck from behind with a hatchet. It was a crushing blow to the head and killed her instantly, but 18 more blows were inflicted before she was left in a room awash with blood. Just before 11 a.m., Mrs. Borden arrived home to find the front door locked and bolted. Bridget, the maid, by now cleaning the windows inside the house, went to let him in and expressed surprise that the door was double locked. She heard a laugh behind her and turned to see Lizzie coming down the front staircase, smiling. Mr. Borden was nearly 70, and walking in the morning heat had clearly tired him. Lizzie fussed around him, told him his wife had gone out after receiving a note about a sick friend, and settled him on the living room settee, where he began to doze, his head resting on a cushion. Lizzie went back into the kitchen and chatted to Bridget about some cheap dress materials on sale in town. But Bridget was still feeling unwell and decided to retire to her attic bedroom for a while. She heard the clock strike 11 o'clock as she went up the back stairs. 10 minutes later, she dashed downstairs again. She heard Lizzie shouting, "Come down quickly, father's dead. Someone came in and killed him." Lizzie would not let the maid into the living room. She sent her across the road to fetch the local doctor, a man called Bowen. He was out on a call. Lizzie then sent Bridget to fetch Alice Russell, one of her closest friends. By this time, the maids rushing about had attracted the attentions of neighbors. Mrs. Adelaide Churchill, who lived next door, spotted Lizzie looking distressed and asked what was wrong. She was told, "Someone has killed father." Mr. Borden had been hacked to death in exactly the same way as his wife. Though his head had been shattered with only 10 blows, the hatchet had landed from behind as he slept, a tricky task as the settee was against a wall. Blood had splashed everywhere. Wall, settee, floral carpet. Dr. Bowen arrived and examined the body. The blows seemed directed at the eyes, ears and nose. He was completely satisfied the first blow had killed the old man. He placed a sheet over the body. Mrs. Russell and Mrs. Churchill did their best to comfort the bereaved Lizzie, fanning her, dabbing her face with cold cloths, rubbing her hands, but both noticed that she did not really need comforting. She was not crying or hysterical, and she assured them that she did not feel faint. She was still strangely calm when the police arrived, declining their offer to delaying the necessary interview until she had a chance to rest. At first, suspicion fell on John Morse, who behaved strangely when he returned to the house. Though a large and excited crowd had gathered in the front of the building, he was seen to slow down as he approached. Then, instead of going inside, he wandered round to the back garden, picked some fruit off one of the trees, and started munching it. Inside the house, his ability came so glibly in the most minute detail that it almost seemed too perfect. But when tested, it was found to be true. Attention then turned to Lizzie, whose behavior had been equally strange, and whose statements were not only curious but contradictory. When Bridget had asked her where she was when her father was killed, she replied, "I was out in the yard and heard a groan." When Mrs. Churchill asked the same question, she said, "I went to the barn to get a piece of iron." She told the same story to the police, saying she had eaten 3 pears while searching in the attics of the barn. But a policeman who checked the attic found no corpse, only undisturbed dust. Mrs. Churchill also recalled the extraordinary reply Lizzie has given when she first arrived and asked where her mother was. Lizzie said, "I'm sure I don't know, for she had a note from someone to go and see somebody who is sick. But I don't know, perhaps she isn't killed also, for I thought I heard her coming in." It was some minutes before Mrs. Churchill and Bridget began to search for Mrs. Borden. They knew she was not in her own room, for the sheet that covered her husband came from there. So they started climbing the front staircase. Halfway up, Mrs. Churchill glanced through the open door to the spare bedroom and saw the body lying on the floor beyond the bed. Why had Lizzie not seen it there when she came down the stairs to welcome her father home? Why had she been trying to buy prussic acid, a little poison, only the day before from shops in town? And why, the previous evening, had she visited her friend Mrs. Russell's, told her the food poisoning episode, and complained about her father's brusque way with people, saying she was afraid one of his enemies would take revenge on him soon? Those were the questions police asked themselves as they pieced together the clues and studied Lizzie's statements. They were sure that the murders had been committed by someone in the household. Though neighbors had noticed a young man outside the Borden house at 9:30 a.m., looking agitated, they had not seen him go in, and police thought it unlikely that a killer could hide in the house for 90 minutes between the murders while Bridget and Lizzie were going about their chores. Bridget was considered suspect and dismissed. Neighbors had even seen her cleaning the windows. Some had even seen her vomiting because of the food poisoning, and she had no known reason for killing her employers. But Lizzie had motives in plenty. The tensions in the family, the quarrels about the money, the hatred of the stepmothers were all known in the area. She was warned that she was under suspicion and told not to leave the house. She accepted the conditions in the arrogant, offhand way that she had dealt with all the police questions. The police obtained a warrant for her arrest, but did not serve it until after the inquest. Though they had found an axe head that had recently been cleaned in the cellar of the Borden house, they had no proof that it was the murder weapon or that Lizzie was the murderer. Once she was arrested, she could use her legal right to silence. It was important to hear her evidence at the inquest. More than 4,000 attended the funeral of Mr. and Mrs. Borden. The two heads were cut off before burial, and the battered skulls sent for forensic examination. A few days later, the inquest opened. It was held in secret, conducted by the public prosecutor, who gave Lizzie a tough time in cross-questioning, and once again, she started contradicting herself. She claimed now that she had not been on the stairs when her father arrived home shortly before 11 a.m., but was downstairs in the kitchen. Asked why she had changed her story, she explained, "I thought I was on the stairs, but now I know I was in the kitchen." She also denied saying she heard her stepmother returning to the house. The public prosecutor was certain she was guilty of the killing. So were the newspapers, which daily poured out torrents of emotional calumny on Lizzie, adding smears and lies to the known facts. But it was one thing to obtain a conviction in print, quite another to win one in the court of law, and the public prosecutor confided in a letter to the Attorney General that he was not confident. His fears were well-founded. The tide of anti-Lizzie propaganda in the press turned public feelings in her favor. How could such a God-fearing, quiet, respectable girl do such a horrible and bloody deeds? Flowers and good luck messages began pouring into Fall River for her from all over the country. Suddenly, the state was the villain of the piece for prosecuting her. Lizzie had something else on her side also. She hired the best lawyer in Massachusetts, George Robinson, a former governor of the state. One of the 3 trial judges was a man Robinson has elevated to the bench while governor. She owed the defense lawyer a favor, and he delivered. The judges refused to allow evidences of Lizzie's attempts to buy prussic acid, saying it was irrelevant to the case, and they ruled that transcripts of questioning at the inquest was inadmissible. Lizzie's friends also rallied around. Both Emma and Bridget gave favorable evidence, playing down Lizzie's enmity for her stepmother. Mrs. Russell admitted that Lizzie had burned one of her dresses the day after her parents' funeral, but insisted there were no blood stains on it. Lizzie, too, played her part perfectly in the court. When she fainted halfway through the hearing, there was an outcry at the way she was being tortured. And as she stood in the dock, modest, refined, neatly dressed, it was easy for George Robinson to say to the jury, "To find her guilty, you must believe she's a fiend. Gentlemen, does she look it?" The jury agreed she did not. After a 10-day trial, her ordeal was over, and she was whisked off for a lavish celebration party, laughing at newspaper clippings of the hearing that friends gave her. She was not very rich, able to inherit her murdered father's wealth, but surprisingly she chose to stay on in Fall River, buying a larger house in the better part of town. Bridget, who many suspected of helping Lizzie to dispose of clues to the killings, returned to Ireland, allegedly with a lot of money from the Borden bank account. She later returned to America and died in Montana in 1947, aged 82. For a while, Emma shared the new home with Lizzie, but the sister quarreled and Emma moved out. Lizzie became something of a recluse, living alone, unloved and whispered about, until she died in 1927, aged 67. Emma, 9 years older, died a few days later. They were both buried in the family plot alongside their real mother, their stepmother, their father, and their sister Alice, who had died as a child. Can Lizzie rest in peace beside the victims of that hot morning in August 1892? No one else was ever arrested for the murders. No one else was even seriously suspected. The case has become one of the most intriguing unresolved mysteries in the annals of crimes. 5 stage plays, a ballet, and countless books have been written about it. Opinion ranges from those who say she was a cunning, calculating killer who twice stripped naked to ensure her butchery left no blood-stained clothes, to the Society of Friends of Lizzie Borden, which still exists today, to persuade us she was innocent. Perhaps in a way she was. In her book A Private Disgrace, American authoress Victoria Lincoln argues convincingly that Lizzie committed the murders while having attacks of temporary epilepsy, the funny turns her family were accustomed to. Lizzie suffered attacks 4 times a year, usually during menstruation. Miss Lincoln said, during a seizure there are periods of automatic action which the patient in some cases forget completely, and others remember only dimly. That could explain Lizzie's confusing statements and her coolness when accused of the killings. Mrs. Lincoln also suggested the trigger to Lizzie's attack. A note was delivered to 92 2nd Street on the morning of 4th of August. But it was not from a sick friend. It was to do with the transfer of a property to Mrs. Borden's name. The first such transaction had driven to vandalism. Did the second drive her to murder? If you have enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment as it helps the YouTube algorithm grow the channel. You'd find similar contents in my other videos. Have a safe day. Signing off.